Hello, I'm John Lewis, Executive Director of Heart Valve Voice US. Welcome to this webinar, Patient Engagement in Medical Device Development and FDA Perspective. That FDA perspective will be provided today by Mimi Nguyen from the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation at the FDA Center for Devices and Radiologic Health. Before turning it over to Mimi, I wanted to provide a bit of background on Heart Valve Voice US. We are a patient advocacy organization focused on improving the diagnosis, treatment, and management of heart valve disease. Patient engagement is critical to our mission, which is why we invited Mimi here today. We have also received a PCORI grant to train patient advisors and will be commencing that training next summer. Please feel free to contact me if you'd like more information on that program. From my personal experience, I know patient engagement can be challenging, especially in an area like heart valve disease where the population tends to be older. I also think it's much more challenging in the medical device area than in the drug space. So I'm very excited to turn this over to Mimi in a minute. We will be taking questions at the end. Feel free to type them into the chat function on the webinar page, and we can also share these slides post-webinar. So thank you again for joining us, and I will now turn it over to Mimi.
Hi, thanks, John. I hope you guys can all hear me okay. My name's Mimi Nguyen. I've been working at the FDA for the past 7 years, starting initially in external expertise outreach, and now working to help develop and build our patient program here in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to provide an overview of kind of what the FDA guidance process is, talk about how we got to developing a patient engagement guidance in the center, and really do some highlights on kind of what is patient engaged, what are we looking at in patient engagement, specifically in medical device clinical investigations. Next slide. So like I said, I'm going to start with kind of an overview on how FDA develops its guidances, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you guys can kind of interact with that process. Next slide. So we should be now on slide 4. That's titled Guidance Development. There's a lot of work that goes into developing our draft guidances. We work with our experts internally. We'll talk to physicians, patients, experts external to us, just to get an idea of kind of what are some of the policies that we need to think about, and really work with our staff internally on what is that policy going to look like, what is the implementation, what are our stakeholders going to say, and really work to kind of go through multiple levels of review and revision. And so in that first stage of drafting and posting, this often takes, I've seen as fast as a few months to years of development of going back and forth to really put together the words that you end up seeing on our guidances. So after we get it posted, and clearly it's gone through many levels of review, sometimes agency, sometimes department level, we'll go out for public comment. Often this is a period of 60 to 90 days in which this is out for comment for stakeholders like patients, patient groups, industry, related industries, so maybe not even our direct industry of medical devices, but potentially pharmaceutical companies, for other stakeholders really engage and talk to us and tell us what they think of the guidance, the draft guidance that we published. So this is a chance for you to say what you like about it, what you don't like about it, things that you would want us to maybe focus more on. All of these are things that we accumulate in our public docket, and that's information that is put out publicly so that we can then take that into consideration as we move to the next step, which is our revisions. We'll take the comments into consideration that we hear from our experts. We may do some follow-ups, have some additional conversations, may have additional workshops to have continued dialogue, and then hopefully from there be able to finalize and really put out that final publication of the guidance document. I want to reiterate that anytime we have draft guidance that's out, that's not something that FDA policy has, I'd say, blessed. It's more our initial thinking, and we're looking to make sure to get that external input before we finalize it. So anything that's a draft guidance means it's something that we as FDA are not implementing yet. It may reflect some of our current options of things that we might be doing, but it's not official policy that we will be implementing at that time. It's not until a guidance document goes final that we then make sure that we have implementation, that we create trainings and do other things to ensure that our staff here are following the procedures and processes that we've laid out in our draft guidances. So if we go to the next slide. Like I said, we're always looking to find ways to gather input. So presentations like this, where we've been invited to talk about our guidances, we'll go to workshops and conferences to really socialize and talk about some of the ideas that we have in our guidances. And we want to make sure we collect that information in the right ways in our docket. So I've provided some links here to help those who might be interested in submitting comments and really learn about kind of some effective ways in which we can do that. And I'll share the link for the docket for our draft guidance that we'll be talking about shortly. Next slide. So now I'm going to do a brief background of kind of how we got to the development of our draft guidance on patient engagement for medical devices. Next slide. Our center director, Dr. Shurin, made sure that our vision and mission statement for the center keeps patients at the forefront. If you see in our vision statement, patients in the U.S. have access to high quality, safe, and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. We put patients at the very front of our sentence, and really patients are the center of what we do. And in the medical industry, we know everything revolves around the patient experience, how patients are interacting with the system, as well as you guys are the consumers, you guys are the ones, everyone is a patient at one point or another. So it makes so much sense for patients to be at the heart of everything that we work on. And with that, we really try to change some of the cultural aspects that we have in our center for our reviewers to make sure to kind of think of that. Although many of us do, interact with patients on a fairly regular basis, it's sometimes a good reminder to kind of change that mindset of we are always thinking of that patient perspective. So if we go to the next slide. Over the years, we've heard a lot about different ways in which we can incorporate the patient voice into things that we're doing. And here are some of the things that we've outlined that we know are very valuable when you incorporate the patient voice into things that we do. So informing the device design itself, or informing the clinical trial, hearing from patients and understanding how can we change and iterate, how can we make this better, how can we make sure that patients want to use these devices. It's a much more iterative process than maybe a pharmaceutical, which will take much longer to see the effectiveness and maybe not be able to make changes as quickly. But it's one of those things where in the device space, we know that hearing from patients is very important in that space, and changes how things are developed, regulated, used, adopted in all different parts of the medical ecosystem. And so in addition to engaging with patients, helping us understand that perspective and the context of which new issues might be arising. So if this is, an issue of a shortage, how do we make sure that patients have access to these devices, even if there is a shortage because of something going on with manufacturing? Do we then have to change what our approach may be to a recall or safety notification because of how patients rely on these technologies? How do we communicate preferences and other pieces of information that we're learning as we integrate that into regulatory decision making? And really, that last one, looking at approaches for identifying populations with a specific benefit risk profile that will be helpful for devices coming out to the market. Next slide. So with that, I'm kind of going to go over a little bit of how we look at patient input at here in CDRH. How do we take the pieces that we hear from patients and kind of how do we categorize and think about how we want to use them? So in the patient program that we've been building here in the center, we really see two parts to the patient input here in impacting regulatory decisions. We see the science of patient input, some of that data collection of assessments or outcomes, and then really the patient engagement, kind of the art of patient engagement. How do you, create the processes? How do you act? How do you change some of those mindsets? And today we're going to really focus more on the patient engagement pieces. If you're interested on the science of patient input that we have other guidances and other information that I have as a list of resources at the end of the presentation. Next slide. So one of the tools that we've been working on in the center has been a pilot program called the Patient and Caregiver Connection. It's made up of a collaboration with various patient groups that allow the staff here in CDRH to access partners and caregivers to share their individual experiences with specific devices, their experiences of living with specific diseases, or current issues that they're encountering in their disease or with the use of their devices. And so this is something that's helping our staff get the perspective of patients and providing context, but it's not something that's providing a group opinion, advice, or recommendations to the agency. This is one of the ways in which we talk to individual patients about their experiences as patients. So if you go to our next slide, we also set up our Patient Engagement Advisory Committee. This is an advisory body made up entirely of patients that can provide recommendations to FDA on engagement activities. So we had our inaugural meeting in 2017, and really, it was designed to really help think about cross-cutting issues in medical devices where patients could really provide that input and recommendation to the agency on certain types of activities, and really make sure that it was representative of the different types of patients that are out there, right? So it is a fairly diverse group that makes formal recommendations and can work with FDA as consultants on various assignments as part of the special government employee regulations. And I wanted to comment, this is the only FDA advisory committee that's made up entirely of patients. So it was definitely something new that was set up, and we are very excited to have them continue to meet. So if we go to the next slide. In 2017, we had our first meeting for the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee. The topic for that meeting was patient engagement in medical device trials. And so, out of that conversation, there was a lot of information that was shared, and one of the recommendations from that advisory committee was to develop a framework or guidance to really talk about how industry can engage with the patient community in clinical trials. And so with that, a lot of us internally started working, taking the information that was collected from the docket, as well as talking to experts in the area, and really worked on developing a discussion document that we released in 2018 during our second peak meeting, and was able to kind of lay out our initial thoughts on patient engagement. We had a draft definition, and we're thinking about some of the high-level pieces of what we wanted to include in a framework. And we had an open docket for that, so that when that closed, we were able to take all that information and really develop a full draft guidance that's now been issued in 2019. If you go to the next slide. So now I'm going to go over and do a brief overview of the draft guidance itself, and then provide some resources that might be helpful for folks, and then go to questions. So next slide. The objectives of this draft guidance are to really to talk to how patient engagement can be used to improve the design and conduct of medical device clinical investigations, to highlight the benefits of engaging with patients, and to really illustrate what kind of activities FDA does not think is research, so that should help outline kind of where the IRB role would be in patient engagement. And really the last one is pretty much what really helps outline on what a lot of this guidance is covering, is address common questions and misconceptions about collecting and submitting FDA patient engagement information for medical device clinical investigation. So if we go to the next slide. One of the key things that we wanted to make sure to do in this guidance is define patient engagement. There's been a lot of different ways people have different organizations have defined patient engagement, and the one that we've put together is something that we feel reflects how we want to see patient engagement used throughout the industry, especially in the medical device space. So we've defined patient engagement as intentional, meaningful interactions with patients that provide opportunities for mutual learning and collaborative, effective collaborations. And so that's a little different than maybe some of the ones you might have seen from PCORI and other organizations for patient engagement. And especially for us, we want to make sure that there's kind of a reciprocity in the process of engagement, because when you engage with someone, you want to make sure that they're getting something, but you're also getting something out of that experience. So that's what we're kind of trying to do with this definition of engagement. So if you like this definition, if you don't like this definition, we're open to comments on how we've defined patient engagement here. If you go to the next slide. We've also outlined distinct roles for patients in the medical device clinical investigations. In our regulations, we have very specific regulations that define who human subjects are. In our guidance, we really try to call human subjects study research participants because we know the terminology has not always been welcome. So here we call study research participants those who are participating in the research as a recipient of either the test, control, or of the treatment. And then we see the role of patient advisors, and this is kind of what we're really trying to carve out in the space of patient engagement. And patient advisors are those who have had experience with a disease or condition and can serve in an advisory or consultative capacity to improve clinical investigation designs and conduct, but who are not study research participants themselves. This really is something we're trying to define specifically in a clinical investigation so as not to create conflicts of interest for those who might be participating, but still can provide input in the design and conduct of these trials. So if we go to the next slide, I've laid out the 4 topic areas. The way that our guidance is written is that there's kind of a definition section, and then it goes into more of a Q&A style, so it's a little bit easier to read. So for those who are interested in certain topics, they can kind of clue in more quickly to the section that's more relevant to them. But we've also tried our best to really keep it something that folks can respond to and that others can use as support for their clinical investigations and their designs. So if we go to the next slide. The first question that covers approaches for sponsors to engage with patient advisors. And here we recommend sponsors or industry to really identify patient advisors and really clearly define what that role would be in their clinical investigation. We know a lot of patient advisors are educated about clinical investigations and may feel welcome to add input, but others may want to have additional training so that they can feel more empowered to provide perspectives during some of these engagement activities. And we would encourage for sponsors or even patient groups to really think about some of those training materials about clinical investigations to help empower some of these patient advisors to feel informed and be able to kind of come toe-to-toe with some of the other key opinion leaders who might be talking and advising on some of the clinical investigation design and conduct. And so some of the activities that we think that patient advisors could really help and participate in would be in the development or testing of informed consent documents, in thinking about the endpoints that are clinically meaningful to patients, thinking about what kind of patient-reported outcome measures could be included in the study or should be considered for post-care, and really thinking about patient preference studies. And this is something that needs to be done prior to the trial, during the trial, or something afterwards that may help in the development of additional material for communications and really understanding the benefit-risk trade-offs. So if we go to the next slide, the next question is, when can input from patient advisors be used throughout the process? And in all honesty, we have to try to spell it out here specifically for the clinical investigation, but clearly we want sponsors to start thinking about this early so that they can think about where it can be best incorporated. There might be times where a study is ongoing already and they're having issues with retention. That might be a time in which you want to pull in a patient advisor. Hopefully you've done it beforehand, so you're not running into these problems. But the reality is we anticipate that this is providing the input from patients through patient engagement can be helpful throughout all parts of the medical device development kind of life cycle system, how you kind of look at it, but specifically in the guidance we've laid out, early is better, and that it may be helpful during ongoing studies if you have issues with participant recruitment or retention. So if we go to the next slide, the next section is on IRBs. And so here, what we're trying to say is essentially that FDA doesn't consider patient engagement activities to require IRB approval, but that the sponsors should still work with their local IRBs and HIPAA boards to determine if there's any specific laws that might still apply in patient engagement activities. And if we go to the next slide, we'll be on our last section for the guidance, in which a lot of folks have asked kind of how can FDA provide feedback on our patient engagement plans. We encourage sponsors to think about including patient advisors early, and we're open to discussing approaches for patient engagement through our Q submission program. The Q submission program is a process in which questions can be submitted to FDA, request meetings and input, and I provided links for more about that program. And you can also request specific programs from the center or the agency to also be involved. So requesting for the patient program to be involved is one way to ensure that the review staff have the other experts in the room to really help in the development of some of these approaches. So if we go to my next slide, in summary, FDA values patient engagement. We really are trying to find different ways in which to encourage our industries to think more about patient engagement, and also encourage our staff to, like I said, change that mindset and want to incorporate the patient perspective. FDA is open to receiving input from all its stakeholders, including patients. So like I said before, I will have information about the guidance and about our docket. So if you have anything you'd like to comment on, that would be your opportunity to. And finally, this is a draft guidance for CDRH, the Center for Devices, and for CBER, the Center for Biologics, specifically on medical devices. But we're really trying to help our industry create pathways in which they feel they can engage with patients to improve the medical device development processes. So if we go to my next slide, I have a direct link to our draft guidance if you want to read it in its entirety. I also have a link to our docket. As of 10:30 this morning when I checked, we have 0 comments to our docket, and it's been open for about a month. So we would love to see additional comments to provide input for us. We always anticipate a lot of comments at the very end, but like I said, we welcome those to kind of read and comment on the docket for us to really see if there's anything that you want us to change about the policy we've been putting out. And our docket currently closes on November 22nd. But technically, even though the docket closes, we can still collect comments. It's just, it's easier for us to make our revisions for our guidances if we collect it by the 22nd. And so if you go to the next slide, I have a bunch of resources referring to a lot of some of the other documentation that we've had. And we also have emails in which you can contact for our various programs. And our director for the Patient Science and Engagement Program is Dr. Michelle Tarver, who was not available for the presentation, but who I work closely with, and I believe is probably, giving another presentation today. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mimi. I expect the attendees to be coming in with some questions. I have a couple to get us started. One more general, and then I have a more specific question. One question I had is how internally you coordinate between CBER and CDRH, between the drug and device trials, what types of information you share, what you see common in the patient engagement in those areas, and maybe what you see as some differences. I'm just very curious about that, because there are obviously different challenges and different levels of patient involvement in drugs and devices.
Yeah, sure. So in the different centers, the Center for Devices, Drugs, and for Biologics, we all have different teams who have been working on various things related to patient engagement and the patient sciences. And so I'd say we do a lot of work to coordinate some of those efforts in the patient-focused drug development meetings that have been happening for, oh my goodness, I want to say like 5 years. I can't remember when the first one started because I feel like they've been going on forever. A lot of device folks have actually attended many of those meetings or have been part of some of the planning, just because at some of those meetings, we're hearing directly from patients, and they may be focused more on some of the drug options at some of those meetings, but some of the outcomes, some of the pieces that the patients have to describe about their living situation, and the pieces that provide that context of understanding what it is for day-to-day life for a patient is something that doesn't matter if they're going to use a device or a drug to treat their disease or condition. This is something that we as a staff, we don't live with these diseases day to day. We need to hear from the experts. We need to hear from the patients, kind of what are those pieces, and by providing these new treatments, are we improving the quality of life for these patients? Are we finding different ways to make sure that they have options for treating what disease or conditions they have? So I would say we do a lot of internal coordination. We work on various workshops and things together, and we usually meet on a fairly regular basis to check in on some of these pieces.
Great, thank you. And then I have a specific question. I know in the guidance you mentioned, or it was mentioned, that the guidance did not discuss dissemination of results or findings from the patient engagement. And I know that is a very common concern and refrain from especially patients who directly participate in the clinical research, that they may not get feedback of the results or of that particular trial. And I just wondered if there's if that's something that you may consider, because clearly that's another area where the patient advisors may advise on, would be how to best communicate the results of the research back to the patients who participated. And I'm just curious what the current thinking is there in dissemination.
Sure. So this is a topic that's come up from that first patient engagement advisory committee meeting and has continued through, I want to say, the second and third ones that we've had this past year. The issue of communication is something that continues to come up and is something that was out of scope for the guidance that we wanted to put out, but we know is a topic of interest through our center, our agency, and I've actually been told even at the department level, so at the Department of Health and Human Services, I think they're currently in discussion on this topic. So there might be something that comes out on it at some point, but it's not something that we're going to be addressing specifically in our current policy.
Okay, thank you. Hoping for some questions from the attendees, but I've got one or two others. And I wondered maybe if from your observation, this may not be directly relevant to the guidance, but your observations on communicating and interacting directly with patients versus patient groups, and how you view that, whether you make a distinction, and obviously oftentimes the patient groups can be conduits to patients to get them more directly involved, but patient groups by necessity have to take a bit broader perspective on some of these issues, while the patients can be much more focused on their particular disease and their particular care. So I just wanted, if you could share some of your perspective on that.
Sure. So especially in the space of patient engagement, we welcome interactions with individual patients as well as with patient groups. At our advisory committees, we do have a lot of patient groups that are represented, but like I showed with our patient and caregiver connection program that we're trying to build, we're very open to talking to individual patients as well to really hear directly from the patients. A lot of it, comes down to the types of input that can be provided, but we're open to having those conversations with individual patients as well as with patient groups. So it's one of those things where it kind of just depends on the method in which you're trying to come in. And for us at FDA, we're open to talking to both, and we don't try to look at it differently, but we do know when we talk to a patient group, oftentimes they will be trying to represent multiple perspectives compared to just talking to one patient with their individual experience.
Great, thank you. And I think I just have one other question, which is along the lines of the guidance mentions, the draft guidance mentions that there are often challenges in finding patient advisors, and it's certainly something we are working on here at Heart Valve Voice in terms of training patient advisors to participate. And I wondered if there's any consideration, and maybe this is something that's being done in some other by some other group or in some other venue that I'm just not familiar with. If there's sort of a clearinghouse for patient advisors, or maybe people who have been trained or raised their hand to want to participate in this kind of thing, and what can be done to facilitate the availability of the patient advisors, so the sponsors have an easier time finding them, and so there's better matches made there.
Yeah, I'd say in terms of the patient advisors, I think, like I said, we are trying to define this term right now, and so I feel like there's not going to be a huge market for them per se, as becoming more of a term more commonly used. And there's no specific clearinghouses that we have been working with in terms of trying to find patient advisors. We encourage our industry to talk to patient groups to potentially find some of those patient advisors, but we don't have any way of kind of endorsing a group for patient advisors specifically.
Okay, thank you. That's maybe something we will put some thought into. Any questions from the attendees? Well, if not, Mimi, is there anything you would like to add as we wrap up?
It's been wonderful chatting with you guys today, and like I said, we're looking for input on our guidance. This is something that we've been working on for, as you can see, quite a few years. We'd love to be able to hear from patients, especially as we're thinking about kind of what those rules are and that definition of patient engagement. So we welcome people to come and comment on our docket. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to email me or email Michelle Tarver. But mostly, thank you for this opportunity to talk about patient engagement.
Well, thank you, Mimi. And actually, we just did have another question come in. If you can hang with us for a minute.
Sure.
Question is, I'm interested in what kinds of technologies are required but missing to make this work and scale across the medical industry.
So that's where we try not to be very prescriptive in patient engagement. We understand there's a lot of different opportunities. We do mention in the guidance in types of activities to consider, such as thinking about, mobile clinical trials, or looking at more remote ways of collecting information, such as using wearables and things. And that's something that the patient perspective, by having a patient advisor present, can really help sponsors decide, is that kind of technology something that's going to be worthwhile? Is that going to give us information to really help support our investigation going forward for approval from FDA? So that's definitely an area that we're very open to, but we're not being prescriptive to kind of what technology out there is something that we want to endorse or anything like that.
Yes, I understand that the technology in terms of wearables and gathering that data, and I just wonder if the questioner was also looking at possibly technologies to facilitate the patient engagement on the advisory side, and I'm not quite sure what that may what that may entail.
So I know of a couple of patient groups. I believe the Michael J. Fox has their Fox Insight.
Right.
Called Insight, kind of a mechanism in which they can match patients to clinical trials. So something like that would be very interesting for patient advisors, and especially for sponsors. I know in working with quite a few sponsors, as they've been thinking about patient engagement, they have struggled finding some of those patients, actually in the heart failure space specifically, since not all patients are going to be involved in every patient group, or maybe there's not a patient group that's very well defined for certain types of diseases. So having something like that could be very helpful, but not something that we're necessarily promoting for in our draft guidance.
Understood. That, yes, that would be maybe a little out of scope at this point, but appreciate that. Well, I think we are wrapped up. Let me just. Yep. All right. Well, thank you, Mimi. Thank you again. And if anyone has questions, feel free to reach out to Mimi or to Michelle Tarver or to us, and we can try to get answers for you. And we thank you all for joining us today, and hope we can do this again soon.